Good day, everyone. I want to make sure that you guys can hear me. So if someone can chime in and let me know that you can't hear me, I can stop playing with my microphone here. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Lamise, and thanks to the entire conference committee for the opportunity to be with you here today. I'm really excited about being part of a first. I don't think we have many opportunities to do that in our lifetime. So I'm definitely excited about being part of your first conference. But I'm also very enthusiastic about the future of behavior analysis in general and the future of behavior analysis in Saudi. So it's just great to be here, and it looks like you guys are going to have a great conference. So what to expect, at least from this hour, by design, the first half of the presentation is more of a cursory review or a skim through some of the topics, while the second half, because it applies to education, is going to be more detailed. And that's because I believe this is where ABA can have the greatest social impact. So I want to spend some time on some of the specifics and details regarding some of the projects we've been engaged in and what some of those outcomes are. So as we get through all of this information, I will throw in some hopefully helpful tidbits of information, helpful hints. Please use at your own risk. I'm sharing these because they worked for me and the people that I'm working with. They may or may not work for your situation. I will intentionally draw from some of my own personal experiences because I do think it's important to humanize. And a lot of times we talk about participants in studies and things like that, and we're sometimes limited with the information we can share. So what I'd like to do is share things that I've done personally, and from that perspective, I can share whatever I'd like if it has to do with some of the things that I've experienced. I'm going to mention a few people that I believe strongly are instrumental or have been instrumental, not only in the things that I've done, but also in the things that are impacting me practicing ABA right now. But there are tons of instrumental people that I just won't have time to mention. So I'm asking for forgiveness before we get too far into the presentation. You'll also notice that I like providing examples in threes. Sometimes that's not possible, but you'll see a trend throughout the hour that we'll be here together. Do have some disclaimers. I think each of these topics warrant its own emphasis and own presentation. And I think within the next couple of days, you may get some of that. In no way am I attempting to discredit any other profession. We need everyone to work together. And I do believe that when you're trying to enhance and expand your own, it doesn't have to be at the expense of anyone else. As I said before, I am going to be intentionally personal with the topics that I'm discussing. And you may find that some of the topics are not necessarily interrelated. I'm not expecting high marks for cohesion, but the common thread is the social significance piece. So I do hope you're able to extract that. My target is to get some of these topics on your radar. I want them to become of interest to you. Maybe they are, and you could develop a greater interest. Maybe they're not. And some of what we're doing can serve as an establishing operation for you to become interested in some of these topics. And then lastly, I'm not representing any group that I am a member of or affiliated with in any way. So Lamise did such a great job providing some background information. I'll spend a whole lot of time doing this, but I do think there are a few important pieces just to make what I'm sharing with you a little bit more relatable. So in terms of area, Louisiana is ranked about 31st out of 50 states. We're a relatively small state in terms of area. Our population is about right smack dab in the middle of the 50 states. So half of the states have more population than us, half of the states have fewer population than us, less population. We have about 400 BCBAs or licensed behavior analysts state. And just to give you some type of historical perspective, we had 16 in 2007, which is the year that I started working in Louisiana. So when you compare this to the population, it seems like we have a bit of a higher proportion of LBAs compared to states with similar populations. And I have some reasons to think why that is such. First of all, we had one of the first licensure laws in the country. And prior to that, we had insurance mandates. And of course, that enables people to provide a service and get reimbursed for it and to earn a decent living. I think our laws have been really well written. Like with anything else, there always will be room for improvement. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. In addition, we regulate at the licensed behavior analyst level, which would be the equivalent to a BCBA, the state certified assistant behavior analyst level, which would be similar to a BCBA, and a registered line technician, which became better known as a registered behavior technician under the auspices of the BACB. Our laws were written before the BACB actually established that credential, so they've not yet caught up with where things are. We do try to emphasize that people do become registered behavior technicians. So I think this gives you kind of a spattering of information that may help clarify the perspective that I'm coming from. So let's shift into some global social issues. That's such a big moniker and it just covers so much, and rightfully so. I'd like to do this through the use of an infographic. And those of you that may know me know that I'm a pretty big fan of the infographic. It's a way to disseminate information to the public. It can be part of a public service announcement campaign where you're introducing something new that may have an impact on the public for the greater good, or you're warning them about things or something like that. Recently, of course, we've had a lot of public service announcements related to COVID and how to mitigate the spread of COVID and so on. So that establishes kind of like the perspective that I try to leverage when we are talking about these issues, because we did develop an infographic in our state. The Louisiana Behavior Analysis Association felt compelled that while we were establishing new laws and engaging in high levels of legislative activity, there would be no better time to educate the public than through the use of a public service campaign, public service announcement campaign, public education campaign. And we did this both formally and informally. And one of the ways we did this formally, I guess, was the development of an infographic. And this infographic went out to everyone. I see it all the time. It is in people's offices. It is at people's workplaces. It's on websites. And one of the beauties of an infographic is that there's a lot of utility. It can actually be utilized in a multitude of ways. And today I'm going to use it for a different way as part of this presentation. There's a lot of information on here. And I think the jumping off point of an infographic is, what can you use it for in order to move forward? And the starting point is, where is the crossroads of what people may know the most about what it is that you're trying to educate them on? I see we have a few questions in the Q&A window. I'm not moderating that, nor am I moderating the chat window. So if someone needs me to respond to something, please prompt me. All right, so let's look at health and wellness to start off with. We'll take a bit of a deeper dive. If we simply do a very basic JABA search, so I went onto our university's library website and I just started searching for different words or pieces of text that were related to the topic of health and wellness. So when I searched using exercise, I found 300 hits, eating over 600, smoking over 200. And those were just some of the basic things that I engaged in order to kind of probe as to how much has our flagship journal published related to these topics. Now, the hits do not necessarily translate into independent articles. Sometimes you have to filter through that because an article may show up twice. And so, but anyway, as I kind of dove deeper into looking at what some of those articles focused on, we had a variety of things. And I just pulled in 3 examples to actually support that case. So one of them had a focus on looking at schedules of reinforcement and exercise routines of individuals that were obese and not obese. And in the United States, we are constantly seeking long-term solutions to the obesity problem. And clearly, I think that the cumulative effect of looking at this through a single subject research lens can certainly augment and supplement some of the existing research out there. Another example was spoon to cup feeding as a treatment for a child with an intestinal failure. So here we have an individual with a specific type of medical diagnosis, not necessarily we're not necessarily treating them for any type of this other type of disabling condition like autism, learning disabilities, which probably has been more of a classic application of behavior analysis, but important nonetheless. And then lastly, one of the articles that I pulled in was related to smoking cessation and abstinence. This had to do with a self-tailored deposit contract. And this particular article, I think one of the authors was Jesse Dallery. And if you're interested in this type of work, Dr. Dallery does a considerable amount of work in this area. So let's shift a little bit to travel and safety, which I think also has become an integral part of things that we're thinking about every day now. So again, using the same methodology within a Java search engine, if we just search for driving, we might end up with upwards of about 200 hits, pedestrians and bicycles not as much, but there are variations of those keywords that we used, and they also produced a similar amount of hits. So with that said, we looked at things like the effects of pedestrian prompts on a crosswalk behavior. We looked at prompting and reinforcement for looking at safety for bicycle and motorcycle riders. As you know, those individuals are very vulnerable. And I think those things, while in and of themselves may not be earth-shattering, they do. It's the cumulative effect of those types of contributions that I think are really important to changing behaviors in society. And then lastly, let's kind of spotlight education. So this appears to produce a little bit more fruit when we look at what we're getting from our Java search hits. So education resulted in over 5,000 hits. That's a pretty broad term. And as you can see with some of the titles here, that ranged from the education crisis to reforming education and to investigating some of the drawbacks from picture interference when we're trying to teach word recognition. So curriculum, we had over 600 hits, and teaching well over 5,000 hits. It's interesting, however, what people call teaching and what they're looking at in some of these studies appear to be quite different. And I think one of the things that we're lacking in some of our own research is identifying the critical attributes of teaching as a science. What does that entail? And that's really what I'm going to spend the latter half of the presentation on. So a bit of a more current emphasis here where we look at social and cultural issues. And as some of you may know, ABAI held its first cultural behavior conference. It was supposed to be in New Orleans, actually, which I was really excited about because that's where I am. However, with COVID, it shifted to online. But with that said, I think there were some really interesting topics that are completely meaningful and important for what we're dealing with in today's world. Changing climate change and the consequence of ignoring climate change, community health improvement, and there were symposia on immigration and human rights. The presenters were great, the topics were great, and it really provided me with kind of a resurgence or some type of renewal that we can truly make a difference in this world, and if we all do our part. And when you think about what issues we can have impact on, I kind of always go from the standpoint, are humans involved and do they behave? And if I tick those two boxes, then my next question is, or my next, I guess, comment is, then there's probably no better science to use than the science of behavior to deal with those problems. If we're not going to use the science of behavior, what science are we going to use? So when you look at that kind of emerging world of cultural behavior scientists, for me, there are three individuals that I guess I'm following, tracking. Maybe some might say that I'm helicopter hovering or something like that. But Tracy C. Hahn, who's based at the University of North Texas, and Dr. Mark Mataney, both were editors on Behavior Science Perspective on Culture and Community. They have a really great editorial. If you want to read that, it's available online. And then Dr. Mataney is also the editor of Behavior and Social Issues, which is a publication of ABAI. And then Dr. Nadowski actually recently produced a paper, Analysis in Practice, related to the development of anti-racist and multicultural training programs in behavior analysis. And while I think there are a lot of position pieces on that topic and a lot of perspectives, what I really appreciated about Dr. Nadowski's article was that she provided some action steps, some tangible things that you can do as faculty chairs, as faculty that are recruiting students, and how to put pieces in place that may not even be on your radar, but will have implications from day one and years to come. And she also includes some really great tables in there. And I'm a big fan of tables because they kind of give you a checklist. And I definitely like that. ABAI also has a special interest group, Behavior for Social Responsibility. And I did use their website several times recently. It's well developed. And I think there are lots of opportunities for people to join that SIG. And I do think it's certainly one of the emerging areas in behavior analysis. With that said, ABAI now has a verified course sequence for cultural behavioral science programs. And I have a list of some of those programs that have a verified course sequence. And what you will see is all of these programs have a very rich history in the field of behavior analysis in general, and subsequently, I think, are probably expanding into these areas, due to that rich history. And this is all available on ABAI's website. So let's kind of unpack an issue that I think has impacted us all over the last year or so, and it's COVID. Um, None of us have been impervious to COVID. I think some areas have been impacted more than others. And I was very pleased to see that we had a lot of researchers, a lot of authors in our field that did not waste very much time getting some papers out. And the Behavior Analysis in Practice had a journal that was dedicated to our response to COVID on many different levels. So to start off with, I think in June, the actual publication came out, but I think these articles were available prior to that in an effort to get them out to the public. We had Cox, Plotnick, and Broadhead produced an article that was related to mitigating the risk, but really trying to analyze and figure out, are we considered essential services? And is this going to apply to all people that we service? And how do we go through some type of screening in order to determine who would get services under these conditions and so on? So I thought what they presented was something that we certainly utilized, but we utilized it against the backdrop of these other two publications. So at the same time, Colombo, Wallace, and Taylor produced an article that it's similar in nature, but I think really established us as essential providers and making the case that our services are essential. And to start off with, especially I think in the United States, because a lot of our service industry is driven by medically necessary services, that comes to the forefront in under pandemic conditions. So it causes us to take pause and to really evaluate, are we providing something that if we don't, will the condition worsen for the individual over time? And I think that that's something you do want to ask yourself, and it's something that we certainly engaged in when making some really hard decisions. And then the LeBlanc et al. Article, I think, really reinforced the Colombo, Wallace, and Taylor article in establishing, our service provision as essential. So all of the articles together, I think, were very helpful in trying to put us in a place where we could think about things systematically. And I think that's a hallmark of our science, is being able to do that. There's an additional article that is coming from the Association for the Advancement of Radical Behavior Analysis from Fabio Tosselin's group and a lot of the individuals working in Europe. And I think it's publicly available. I'm not 100% sure. I know I got my hands on it and I was extremely impressed with how they took everything apart. And in this article, they're really talking about using the science, OBM components, to actually curtail the spread. And so it's not just about how our industry needs to respond to this regarding clinical practice, it's how we can change our behavior as humans in order to deal with the spread or try to moderate the spread of the pandemic. And I think it's a huge contribution, and hopefully it is available to everyone because I think it's something major that our field has contributed. So let's make this a little bit more personal and talk about what did our team do. So as Lamise referenced in her introduction, I'm involved with a lot of different teams, and I think most of us are. Most of us all wear different hats in this field. When you're involved in a burgeoning profession, it's just what you do. And so with that said, I'm involved with a lot of groups that are providing different types of ABA services. And so we needed a game plan. Somehow we had to figure out, how are we going to survive? And how will our constituents survive, our clients, our students survive? Because we believe strongly that our services are needed. So we drew from all of the recent published research. We looked at the relevant OBM literature. And we just, and I don't want to make it sound like it was this easy, and I hope that I don't come across as any of this is easy or overly simplistic, but we just tried to adhere to the principles and the tactics. We had numerous antecedent strategies, tons of visuals, reminders to look at visuals, personal timers going off, classroom timers going off, looking at risk management situations like, does this child need to be in a center? Will they be of harm to themselves or others if they're not? Can we provide this service in a home? Is the home a multi-generational home? Would that put more people at risk? And so on. Could we simply provide our services through telehealth or parent education or something like that? Our workers that were considered essential, we had to help them set up some self-management goals, some self-monitoring checklists, and then tying that into some consequence strategies. We consistently remained in operation, meaning we never closed, we never shut down. When there were lockdowns, we were still providing services under strict observation and strict monitoring. We analyzed data daily, and then made those decisions daily and adjusted procedures daily. We certainly used the tactics to use within the telehealth and virtual education paradigms. And we did see in some cases that learning outcomes were actually enhanced under those conditions, which caused us to take some pause and reflect on what we were doing prior to that. And we also communicated regularly with state, local, and federal authorities. We had data shares on a regular basis, and we were of interest to them. We were operating in several different geographical areas. We had children, young adults. Children were not necessarily wearing masks, the adults were, and they were very interested in what we were doing. And this is one of the reasons why we were able to continually service 100 children under those conditions. And we were able to keep 200 staff gainfully employed. Our families at home used our health and safety procedures to help mitigate the spread in their homes, which we think that was a very important thing to do. But obviously they had people in their homes who weren't getting services from us. And we just thought that that was great that we saw continuity in what they were doing. As I said, our clients were successful in school settings, both virtual and in person. And the penultimate bullet point is really, I think, the heart of what we were concerned about. We had 0 instances of internal transmission of COVID-19, meaning that it was not transmitted from one person to another under any of our roofs, so to speak. There were people that acquired it outside of work, but through our monitoring processes, we were able to catch that at the door and identify the source. And then when schools and other facilities began to open, we consulted with the schools so they could actually use our plans that we had used throughout the whole process for reopening. So I think that, these outcome data are fairly obvious in regards to the social significance. All right, so now we're going to take this again to an intentionally personal level. So in the middle of all of this, on April 23rd, I had a heart attack, and subsequently I had open heart surgery. I didn't know it was coming, although looking back, there were some signs. So some of the mitigating factors were I had gained quite a bit of weight in a short amount of time. And I had a family history of a coronary heart disease. My father had a heart attack at 55. My grandfather had a heart attack at 55. And I had a heart attack at 55. So what did I do? And I was in a situation where I was extremely depressed once everything was over. I have a slide of all the different medications that I was taking. But the doctor told me, there's a chance that you can reverse some of this, but it depends on your behavior. Well, certainly my ears perked up. And of course, I knew this before, but when you're immersed in it and everything else that's going on in the world is going on, you don't necessarily go there as the first place when you're thinking about things. So here's some of the things that I did. I used some self-monitoring checklist to check off everything that I was doing that should be doing, and then set some self-management goals in small, measurable increments. I needed to contact reinforcement as quickly as possible. Then I arranged those reinforcers so I could meet the goals, and it worked quite well together. Had sometimes very small goals that I was going to take 10 steps in a day, then 12 steps the next day, and so on. But setting them that way and graphing them made all the difference in the world. I did publicly post my outcome data. It's all over my refrigerator, all over the wall next to my bed. I did implement some mildly aversive punishment procedures. I still use one to this day. Rubber band on the wrist. When I wanted to eat things that I knew I shouldn't, if I was getting close to my calorie count, that was one little tactic that I used. I collected ABC data and functionally analyzed the variables, and I used a reversal design with my physicians in order to isolate some of those variables that were causing problems. So here's what my outcome data look like. This graph is the actual graph from my weight loss. And I'm not sure you can see the kind of ABC type of data that I was taking, but I continued to have spasms, which were debilitating. And I collected data on the duration of them, whether it was a full cycle spasm or not, what were my symptoms, and I assigned numbers to those symptoms, the time of the day. Was it after I had taken my meds, before I took my meds, the location, what were some of the antecedent events, and what was my response to the whole episode. And I did this because my doctors couldn't figure out how to help me. And so we talked about this, and through this analysis, I was able to go through this amount of medication, and these were some of my vitals. And what they wanted to see was, could I change some things, alter some things, and then reduce the amount of meds and stay at those same levels? And fortunately, I was able to do those things. All right, I know we're getting a little short on time, and I'm kind of notorious for kind of running us into a wall here, but I'm just very enthusiastic about the topics that I'm sharing. And obviously, when we get to the personal level, I tend to be even more enthusiastic, so you can't hold that against me. With that said, I'm going to cover this as quickly as possible and then try to finish up with the last 15 minutes on education. There are some things that are going around right now in the published literature as well as social media related to critiques, and I'll probably use that word in a very polite way, critiques related to ABA and the neurodiversity movement, some research, and I use that term loosely, on post-traumatic stress disorder, and then maybe even an overemphasis of our field on compliance. So what has happened over time is some of these articles have gotten published, and then our field has published a rebuttal. So in the Cooperstein article, Justin Leaf and colleagues published a rebuttal. And then in the Sandoval Norton article, we have some other authors in our field who have published a rebuttal. And that's important. It's important. You have to respond to things. You cannot be tone deaf about what people are saying. And there's some things that I think are really important to summarize what's transpired here. First of all, in general, I think that when we're responding to accusations, we have to think about a few things. First of all, it is possible that there have been some behavior analysts or people practicing behavior analysis that have engaged in some type of malpractice. We're not impervious to that. Every helping profession may see that. So I do think it's important to take their claims seriously and acknowledge that some of this may have occurred, just like it occurs in any other field. However, with that said, there were some inherent problems with how they went about collecting data, and I use that term loosely. First of all, what we don't know is in some of these publications, are the individuals that they're speaking about claiming to have autism, did they really have autism? In some of the articles, they don't even report how that was determined. A lot of those data were collected via phone interviews or internet interviews, so there are questions that lie with that. The methodology was definitely questionable. We don't know what types of services these individuals received. Was it even behavior analytic in nature? And if it was it even provided by a person with the appropriate education, training, and experience? And that's why licensure and certification is important. So I think there are some big questions. What is disturbing is that in some of these articles, they are not just talking about ABA in some instances with some people. Some of their statements are quite sweeping that all of behavior analysis is not good for anyone. And that we know is not true. We know we have evidence to show that to the contrary. I did think that UK CABAS had an ABA schools response that was quite impressive. They talked about how the accusations are at odds with their own experience and not supported by research evidence or by the endorsement of public bodies. And then what they did is they took schools that are overseen by Ofsted. I'm sure you have similar agencies in your country. And they looked at ABA schools and how did they fare on those Ofsted reports? And many of them received outstanding credentials, outstanding accreditation scores. So how would it be possible for all of this harm and trauma to be going on in a school when independent bodies can go in and determine that this is not only, you know, good stuff, it is a high standard and a bar by which we think others should be achieving. All right, let's shift into licensure, certification, and regulation. Dr. Gordon Borland and Dr. Neil Martin will be presenting, I think, a lot of information on this topic, so I do not want to rehash or hash anything that they're going to discuss. However, I think there are some things that you do want to consider, and those are related to the bullet points. The purpose of having a regulated profession is to protect the consumer, to make sure that there are standards that are established so that a person receiving the services can know with confidence that they're getting at least what the industry has determined as a minimal. All right. It does allow the profession to be more credible, I think, when it has some type of status or statute. It helps to establish that profession's scope of practice. It gives the consumer some recourse if something is violated, so they have some protection, as I stated before. And it does, I guess, may have an impact on accessibility to services. You may have individuals that are providing ABA services that are legitimate services, and for whatever reason, they may not be able to get licensed or certified. That is possible. It happens in lots of different fields. And so that needs to be taken into account when I think you are establishing a Title and Practice Act. And so some of that might have to do with if someone's an experimental researcher, they're engaging in ABA or behavior analysis. It might be experimental analysis, and maybe they need to be exempt from some of the licensure requirements. And I do think that both Dr. Martin and Dr. Borland will be speaking towards that. So some considerations, always realize that no matter where you are, politics are involved in this. None of us are trained politically, so you have to really kind of take some crash courses on how to do that. You need to know what your barriers are, and you need to address those concerns and be proactive about the solutions. Come up with ways to ameliorate those issues that will be brought up by your agencies that you're having to go through in order to get some type of regulation. By all means, utilize all of your professional resources. ABAI has a licensing committee, APBA and the BACB all have resources to assist you with information. Every situation is different. Every state is different. Every country is different. And so you want to take that into account. It's not just about cutting and pasting. You need to really figure out, how is this going to work against the backdrop of our country? And you need to determine who you can trust. Sometimes that's not who you think, and that needs to be okay. You have to know the sources of reinforcement and punishment for everyone's behavior that you're dealing with when possible. All right, and again, Dr. Martin and Dr. Borland will be presenting on this topic, I think, in greater detail. All right, moving along quickly, another really important piece that I do want to share with you is the importance of working with other disciplines. So several years ago, I started working with a law professor at one of our universities here, and he became very interested in what we're doing. We wrote 2 articles together in the law literature related to single subject research design. And we made an argument that the Food and Drug Administration in the United States should be utilizing single subject research design in part of their current, as a part of their current testing paradigm. And we used the backdrop of ABA to make the case. And I took an excerpt from the article and I kind of plopped it right here so you can see that put ABA on the radar of a whole different group of professionals. And one might say, so what? What does it matter? It's going to take a lot more than that in order to make some differences. But it did. So from that interaction, what happened was Professor Malinowski said, hey, our people are not trained on how to look at these issues from a legal perspective. And it seems like every time we're turning around, you guys are in need of someone to do that. So I would like to start a disability law and policy class. So he developed that class. From that class, in its inaugural semester, 2 students became very interested in that topic. One began working with one of our state autism access associations, and the other one began working with families. And so we have one in the field of advocacy with professional groups and one in the field of advocacy with families. And from that point, they're having influence on others. So now what we're seeing is more competency in the law profession and more public awareness of ABA. Again, I do think that it is a byproduct of getting involved in other disciplines. And again, that was a personal experience that I had. I'm not dictating or suggesting do the same thing, but think about those things. And I think there are going to be opportunities that present themselves that I think warrant you to seize them. So let's shift a little bit and a sidestep. Let's look at science. And when you think about over the years, some of the problems that science has solved, some major things. One of them is occurring right before our eyes. So we did solve all of these problems with science. However, when we look at education, education has not embraced science in the same way. And I think that's fairly obvious because a lot of times it is driven by politics, it is driven by fashion, it is driven by other types of movements. But it's not surprising or shocking that we are still dealing with the same problems we dealt with 50 years ago. So while society advances, we become more sophisticated and more um, uh, capable of solving problems, we are still riddled with problems in the field of education. And not trying to save anything for the end, I believe strongly that behavior analysis is the answer to most of those problems. So here's just a quote that I like to share every time. I do think that when we're looking at what we want education to achieve, we want to make sure that it becomes a reinforcer for all individuals in that field, whether it's a consumer or a professional. That's what really is going to push everything along. And I think it takes a lot of our science and conditioning procedures to be able to do that. A lot of times we're brought to the educational table against the backdrop of fixing a problem, a fire, putter outer. But what we know about how to engage in good, sound, scientific educational practices is far beyond that. And we are wasting our talents, at least from my perspective, and probably having a lesser impact on the children if we don't look at what we can do in an overarching manner. I think these are some of the entry points for behavior analysts in schools that may or may not line up with the way services are delivered in your country, but I think there's some comparables for each one of these entry points. And this is a quote that one of my professors always shared with me: children can only progress as fast as the expertise of those who teach them. And teachers can only progress as fast as those who teach and mentor them. And it takes a science-based system to do all of that. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of information about the CABAS-based system. This is one system of providing educational services. There are others. This is the one I'm mostly familiar with, so this is why I'm sharing it. Piece that I want you to look at is who's at the top of the organizational chart. It's the student. The student's data drives everything. Here are some of the critical attributes that are related to the CABAS system, and each one of these could warrant its own presentation also. So now we could look at some of the characteristic practices as teaching is applied behavior analysis, which is what we do in the classrooms of CABAS model or CABAS endorsed classrooms. Instruction's individualized. We teach using moment-to-moment responses. We make sure that the classroom is predominantly positive. We train teachers as strategic scientists. We always make sure that data are available for visual inspection, and that the progress of the students are always available for the view for all the stakeholders. We want the teachers to continually to measure their behavior as well as the students' behaviors, and that we use those graphs to make decisions. We want to incorporate empirically tested curriculum. We're not necessarily Googling things or designing it out of whole cloth. We want to make sure there's some evidence to show what we're using works to deal with the academic deficits that we're trying to address. And all of that fits under the umbrella of using the principles of science. Excuse me. I'm going to get to some data quickly. So please pardon me right now for speeding along. We looked at we've looked at several different classrooms over the course of schools over the course of decades. However, the two classrooms that I'm bringing today with the data are related to some different types of classroom. One of them is an RTI classroom, response to intervention. These children are not diagnosed yet, they're not in special education. And the other one is a general education classroom. And I'm going to show you what we did in both of these classrooms and realize it's going to be fast. We gave the teachers a checklist to use to determine if they were using the data to solve a problem. A lot of times in response to intervention classrooms, the interventions are already selected and you keep monitoring the child every week. And when they get to a certain level, you pull in the predetermined intervention. We wanted to stop that. We wanted to continue to monitor every week, but have them look at the data and analyze the data and then determine what is the possible source of the problem and what am I going to change. So all these data show are each student's data in each of these response to intervention classrooms. And the black solid line that you can't really see would be the overall trend in the data before they started making these decisions. The dotted line is the projected trend that it would have continued at. And the solid black line on the right side of the phase change line is where the new trend ended up because they were making decisions. So what you're looking for is a gap between the solid black line and the dotted line. The greater the gap, the more of an impact the decision making made. That's classroom 1. Oh, sorry about that. Classroom 2, we still have a gap, but it's a smaller gap. Classroom 3, big gap here. The trend changed immensely. And each of these classrooms picked a different thing that they were going to focus on because of the data. We didn't dictate what they selected. And then this classroom is our control group, unintentionally, meaning the teacher just never really participated. But look at the difference. The projected line is higher than where the actual outcomes ended up. So that these kids ended up doing worse. All right, and that just shows you a summary of the differences. One tactic was increasing the opportunities to respond. The other tactic was rate training. And then the other tactic was a peer yoked contingency because the kids weren't paying attention to each other. Then quickly, I'll get to this piece of data. This was an accelerated independent learner classroom, which was a general education classroom. There were a few kids with special needs, but most of the kids were neurotypical and high performing. These were some of the tactics that were in place. And we implemented these things in a systematic way. First 9 weeks of school, it looked like this. Second 9 weeks of school, we added what you see in red. Third 9 weeks, end of school. So that's how we systematically got these pieces in place. Here are some pictures of the classroom, a lot of peer tutoring. You'll notice that the students are taking their own data. You may see those token cups where there's money or pretend money in the token cup. They're delivering their own reinforcers, reinforcing each other, taking their own data. They're working out of PSI binders. This is how we collected the data. This was a data sheet that a child had. They were just recording their own data, and then we did intermittent checks to make sure that they were accurate. So here's what our data looked like related to what we were brought to the table to try to solve to start off with. One of the tests they use to determine progress is the dynamic indicators of basic early literacy skills. So in our classroom at mid-year, 23% of our children scored intensive. And in the matched classroom, not getting AIL, 25% of those kids scored intensive, meaning they're more at risk for special education services. At the end of the year, what was important, because historically that number always got bigger at this particular school. So we were able to stop that trend. It's not a huge difference, but we stopped the bleeding, so to speak. And in the matched classroom, it actually increased as much, if not more, than what we decreased by. All right, so why do we want to do all of this? Because it helps lots of different children and all types of children, not just children with developmental disabilities. I'd like for you guys to get involved with FAST, and you'll find out more about this if you go to this particular website, thescienceofteaching.org. And FAST is kind of the nonprofit foundation that is established to disseminate what we're doing here today. Next chapter, you're going to see Dr. Ainsley, and she's going to talk about the next chapter, I believe. So I'm looking forward to that. I did want to leave you with this. You know, it's interesting when you look at the field of science, and I was able to find the 10 best scientific discoveries in 2020. Wouldn't it be great if one day behavior analysis could be something that we've done is part of one of the generic scientific discoveries? And I just took one of the areas of science and physics, and they promote their top 5 physics breakthrough in any given year. So I do think that this is something our field needs to consider, and that's another way to disseminate. So what if we found out that in 2035, we had some new principles of behavior discovered, new applications of existing principles? I think we can get there if we work on a few things. I think that one thing that I do want to draw your attention to is that if we look at the number of Research One institutions in the United States, there are 131 of those, meaning they have the highest level of research activity. Out of that 131, 5 have been ABAI accredited as with doctoral programs. Now, there are more ABAI accredited doctoral programs, but not all of those are Research One institutions. It's at this level where we're going to develop scientists that will expand our science, because right now what's happening is that it's becoming a master's level driven discipline because of need and for good reasons, but we can't let that cannibalize the scientific rigor and how we got here is really where I'm going. So I think that's just food for thought. I wanted to leave you with. Keep this in mind. The Ryan and Deci article related to intrinsic motivation is one of the most cited articles in psychology. It's only been published in 2000, and there's over 30,000 hits, or 30,000 citations, not hits, I'm sorry, citations. Meanwhile, our 2 most cited articles have very few. And so Dr. Donaldson presented this at Babbitt recently, and it was against the backdrop of overused and understudied. But I think this is a glaring statement, and the way we're going to, one of the ways that we're going to deal with this is by getting those PhD programs and getting more people interested at top tier universities in studying behavior analysis. Don't forget to celebrate World Behavior Analysis Day tomorrow. And I'd like to, a special thanks to all of the families and children that I work with and the colleagues. Thank you so much for your time. I know that I am 3 minutes, 4 minutes over, and I hope that I am not punished for that.